So, welcome everyone. I'm Tom Fournier from the History Symposium, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Donald E. Graves to this session. Don Graves is a well-known Canadian military historian who's published his first work on a War of 1812 subject in the late 1970s, and since that time has brought out 5 books on 1812 topics, as well as 3 volumes of memoirs, and edited a new edition of a classic history of the war. Don Graves has also produced 11 books or monographs on other topics of Canadian military history, ranging from 1690 to 1945. I've had the honor to get to know Don through some of our past work hosting War of 1812 themed conferences. We'll allow Don to further introduce himself through our opening questions for the segment. This is the first of what is planned to be a number of conversations with Don that we will host and archive here on our YouTube channel in a distinct playlist. So, Don, you are considered one of the foremost authorities on the War of 1812 and are a considerable historian. You're certainly my favorite historian as it relates to the War of 1812. Can you tell us about your background and how you came to be a historian?
Well, actually, choosing a career as a historian was my third choice of career. My first choice was to be a country and western singer. Problem was I could never master the guitar. My second choice was to be a lawyer. I spent a year in law school. It soon disabused me of that notion, so I took history as a third choice.
Now,
And
your first one around the musician. I don't know if you're joking or not. I do know you have quite an interest in the music associated with the War of 1812. So,
well, merry hearts make light days. Always remember that.
all right. So you had an abortive attempt at a legal career. My first year was engineering. I don't think I
Uh,
liked the program and many of the people in there. So after taking a year off to rethink my priorities, I came back to university again.
yeah, well, the world doesn't need another lousy engineer, another lousy lawyer. There's too many of them out there. Anyway, I ended up studying history. Um, I did honors at the University of Saskatchewan, and my master's was at Carleton in Ottawa.
Okay, okay, you broke up for a moment there. So University of Saskatchewan for your undergraduate?
Yeah, my honors degree. Yeah,
Okay, and then master's at Carleton
yeah.
in Ottawa. So just we have an international audience. It's good to expand on that a little bit.
Okay.
All right. So why has the War of 1812 captured so much of your focus?
Well, when I was studying history, I mean, I'd always been interested in military history, and the period that interested me most was the Napoleonic period. But I realized as I went on and got farther in my university studies that I wouldn't be able to get access to the primary sources from Canada. And I'd have to go there and research, and money being tight. I uh, I fell back on the War of 1812 because it's not often known, not often uh, realized, but it's a theater of the Greater Napoleonic War. So this is what got me into the War of 1812. Also, there's some family history too. I had my mother's side were an old loyalist family, and I had some ancestors in the War of 1812. Um, they were they came over in 1783, 1793, that part of the family, and settled near Ancaster. I'm still I have roots in the Hamilton area. I'm still a Ticats fan, and they're doing very well this season. Um, I was always interested in reading. My favorite authors were C.S. Forster and G.A. Henty, who not read much anymore, but this guy was an incredible English author, worked in 1870 to about 1910. I think he wrote 150 books, and they were always on history, and it always featured two major characters. The bright guy was a blonde, and his sidekick was a brunette, and they always met two women, one blonde, one brunette. And after many adventures, they would he would close the book and they say they lived to a green old age. I'm still trying to figure out what a green old age is, but anyway, I mean they had titles like with Wolfe in Quebec, with Frederick in Prussia, with Wellington in Spain, um, uh, St. Bartholomew's Eve. And the first two chapters of every book was nothing but a historical context background. And he was very, very important on this. But then later the adventures would start. But it got a little bit crazy. The hero and his sidekick joined the Prussian army under Frederick the Great, and they were because his father had done some service for Frederick. He was given a commission as an ensign. By the end of the book, he was a colonel in the space of about 3 months. You just couldn't believe it. I haven't read one in a long time. I picked one up and started reading it, just fell apart laughing. But when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, this is impressive stuff. Um, where was I going? And the other thing was, I'm a great film buff, and I was lucky with the small town where I grew up. Our house was 3 blocks from the local theater, and every Saturday afternoon, in the fall, winter, and spring, be down there for the Saturday matinee. For 20 cents, you got two full features, cartoons, a newsreel, and trailers. And some of the movies there, as we went back home, we often reenacted the movie on the boulevards. It was quite funny. But the two movies I remember that influenced me the most was with Gregory Peck. I really liked that one. And the other one was a movie called The Pride and the Passion. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. It was a
No,
you've never seen that?
no, I don't think so.
Oh, you can get it on YouTube, I think. It's based on C.S. Forster's novel The Gun. When I say it's based on C.S. Forster's novel The Gun, I mean there's a big gun in it. There's a big gun in the book. The rest of it, it's just you have Frank Sinatra as a Spanish guerrilla captain. You have Cary Grant as a captain of the Royal Navy, and you have Sophia Loren, well, for the love interest and the scenery. The story is uh, Spanish army's retreating after a defeat, and they have this huge gun. Cary Grant says it's a 96 pounder, which it isn't. But they have this huge siege gun, and Grant arrives from England. He wants to pick up the gun, and Sinatra wants to go to Avila, which is the headquarters of the French in Spain, which is not. So they have this incredible trek across Spain and getting all kinds of things. Uh, Actually, when I was down at Fort George in July, my friend and I found it on YouTube and started to watch it and ended up rolling around the floor. Uh, but the gun is the real character. The gun is the thing. Anyway, take a look at it.
I
I do
will.
remember that it wasn't on the Saturday matinee. It was an evening show, and my brother had to take me because of my age. And I suspect that was because Sophia's Loren's dresses exposed her big guns. And didn't mean it to me then. And I was looking at it last July and thinking, wow, well, what a lady. Uh,
So I'm trying to follow this. So Sophia Loren inspired your interest in the War of 1812. So,
well, partially, or my interest in big guns, I guess. Um, and well, I said I went to university. I was a late student. I was a mature student. I did a lot of things in the late 60s and 70s before I decided I better get an education. And so I went to university. It came out of Carleton. I was hired out of Carleton by Parks Canada right out of graduate school. I was lucky. And I worked for Rennie Chartrand. He was at that time uh, chief curator, military, national curator, military. His title kept changing every 4 days. And so I worked for Rennie for a long time. He was a good friend of mine. It's sad he's passed away last year. And
yes.
then I was hired to do a historical report, and the subject was interesting. It was the Fort George officers' quarters and Powder magazine, which brought me down to Fort George. And the result was a manuscript report. Parks Canada used to publish these manuscript report series, they call it. Mine is 353. But it got me into officer's lifestyle. It got me into military medicine. It got me into powder handling and storage, all during the War of 1812. And that was an interesting job. And then after that, I got a job as the curator of the Army Museum in Halifax. Loved the job, didn't like the city, but I learned a lot about weapons there. Oh, I should mention that one of my little jobs before I got the historical report series was to come up with a safe and accurate gun drill for smooth bore animation at Fort George. And to do it, I took my old manual for the M101 105 millimeter howitzer, which is the weapon I served, and sort of brained it down and got someone who was an artist and drew pictures. And we had a safety procedure to fire a gun, to fire a howitzer, to fire a mortar. I wouldn't advise you to do the latter two unless you really know what you're doing. But anyway, when I got to Halifax, Parks Canada was having problems. There at that time, the ordnance they were firing on historic sites, they were using a traditional service test. It's a test to destruction. What you do is you use 2.5 times the service charge with a triple wad and ram down tight, and that increases the breech pressure, so the gun will withstand its proof. And if it withstands that, it's okay. So then they go down they don't put in the I think at one point we were doing French 16 pounders, which is a British 18 pounder. And all I remember is we were putting black powder into pantyhose. That's what we used. And it was a complete leg of pantyhose, rammed her down good. And then the tubes were on bulks on the ground. And then we put fine powder down the priming hole and slow match. We tried friction primers. They didn't work. They never seemed to work. We found slow match was good. Got back to a safe distance behind a berm. And I had a Y scope, World War I Y scope from the museum, so we could watch it and then hit the slow match. Back she went. They go back 6 feet on these bulks with that much powder, and we got quite good at it. I remember one session we ended up firing off about 50 every 15 minutes. We fired off 4 guns. Yeah. No, we did the whole routine. I'd done magazine details in the militia. We removed all ferrous metal, anything that causes spark, and we were very careful loading those pantyhose. And I always remember there's an old park warden at that time at Louisburg, and he was a bit of a legend in the park service. And he had ribbons from Italy. He fought in the army in Italy, and he liked to come over and tell us tales. Never forget. He was telling his tale, and we're very serious, but you kind of laugh about this idiot who took a blasting cap and put it in a vise and whacked it to see what would happen. I'll never forget this phrase. He said, "Up went the cap, thumb and forefinger." It just broke me up at the time. Broke us up. We were yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I came back to Ottawa, did a stint at the National Archives in the manuscript section, got very familiar with the document and the archival records for the War of 1812. And I had a detour for 3 years in the Department of Justice. Don't want to talk about it. And then I was hired as a staff historian, the director of history, D&D. So that brought me right up to the 90s.
So that directorate of history, that was an aspect of the Canadian Army?
It's the Defense Department.
Okay.
It's the director of history. The major task when I was there was working on the official histories of the Canadian forces. We the director that brought out the Army history in the 50s, and they just about halfway through the Air Force history. I worked on the naval history, which they gave me that because I knew nothing about navies, of course. So I got all odd jobs. They were big on anti-submarine warfare, and I wasn't. So I did landing craft like amphibious warfare. I did naval aviation. I did liaison with the RN, and I did fast attack craft, motor torpedo boats. And I did the reports, which were later put in the 2 volumes of official Navy history. I should explain to people that the term official history doesn't mean it's government history. Um, it's national history in the sense of warts and all. Can be very critical. And there were always attempts I'd heard about politicians trying to change things, and it was always resisted. So where are we now? We're back in the 90s, and they downsized D&D, and my old boss had retired, and I wasn't too keen on his replacement. So I took a magnificent buyout, threw it into investments, and it's what I live on mostly now. Then I became a heritage consultant, and I worked on the Chippawa battlefield. I worked for national parks in the States, worked for CBC, I worked for a couple of film crews, uh, and I also was writing books. Uh, I was paid to write, so I had a lot of jobs.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to turn to a question I asked you earlier this summer when I saw you at Fort George. So we're going to talk more specifically about the War of 1812. And then what do you think is the most pivotal battle associated with the war?
Yeah, we did discuss that. I don't think there's a pivotal battle like Stalingrad or Waterloo or Midway. There's important battles, but there's no single battle that really had an influence on the way the war turned out. Uh, um, but they're important battles. Plattsburgh, very important. That was a major British offensive of the war from the north, and it was defeated, or actually, it was a naval and land offensive of the Navy. The naval aspect was a complete defeat, and the land aspect, well, I think Prevost retreated too soon. Um, the twin American victories at on Lake Erie and the Thames, I think, were very important because they did away with the military power of the Northwest Indigenous Confederacy. Um, Crisis Farm also was an important battle, although James Wilkinson wasn't really a happy camper. It was enough to cause him to retreat across the border and not go for Montreal. That was the most serious American offensive of the war. If they'd started maybe 2 months earlier, they might have made it, but I don't think they would have got Montreal. Um, but again, the theater that's I think is overlooked is the Upper Great Lakes, the attacks on Mackinac Island in 1812, 1814, and the capture of the Tigris, USS Tigris, and Scorpion. Uh, that really should bears more examination because, again, there are few troops involved, few combatants, but it was a vast area and was a very important area. Yeah, I think more should be spent on that.
Yeah, and it's funny, the Tigris and Scorpion, you hardly hear about that, and you think like what a tremendous feat. Like the attacking forces coming from Mackinac to like across the open water of Lake Huron, seeking out those vessels and then
Yeah,
capturing them or
yeah.
capturing the one and then luring the other one into its demise.
It's
So yeah.
it sounds like Hollywood, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Um,
Well, this you kind of tailed off with what was going to be my next question. What's important but relatively unknown actions of the war and Mackinac And I think you also mentioned in our pre-work about the Mississippi. So, sort of, what was some of the activities up that way?
Well, yeah, Sergeant McKay of the Royal Artillery and his gun, Zachary Taylor, getting whipped. Later became president. A lot of that had to do with the fur trade. The fur trade was more in this time wasn't a bunch of guys in check jackets going out and wearing fur hats and checking trap lines. It was a very major commercial enterprise, and the thing was the fur trade constantly moved west and north because beavers need a lot of beaver is the prime pelt. They need a lot of uh, area, and they're constantly on the move for new areas. Um, so a lot of that upper Mississippi stuff had to do with the Canadian fur companies, which were the prime ones in that area, and they wanted it. So there is a commercial basis on that. But let me think on uh, another battle that was the attack on York, and that really shook Upper Canadians. And a month later there was the attack on Fort George and the American taking possession of the Niagara. Gee, when you start getting down to it, almost every battle had some result, but no one battle had a global result in the sense that it affected the outcome of the war. And then there's New Orleans. Uh, about 20 years ago, I was invited by the National Park Service to join a roundtable of scholars of the War of 1812 and the Rev War. And I was the only Canadian invited, which I thought was a great privilege. And they sat all these historians around a big table, and in the back were the National Park Service staff. And what we were to do was to rate each battle of the Revolutionary War and each battle of the War of 1812 and give it some kind of priority, most important, not quite so important, but we got to preserve it, and then down to we'd like to preserve it, maybe it has to go. The thing was uh, part of the Civil War battlefield had been sold to developers, and there was a big squawk and scream over this. And finally, the Congress stepped in and paid an exorbitant amount to buy the land back from the developer. So they said, we don't want to go through this again. We want you to examine every battle site for the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and categorize them. So that's what we did. And it was funny because I'm sure you've been in these situations where you have to introduce yourself. My name's John Smith. I do this, I do that. And we did that. I'm Professor so and so. I teach. It just so happened that I was the last one. I went around the table, and I was the last one. And I said, "My name's Don Graves. I'm here from Canada to represent the interests of His Majesty King George III of England. God bless his memory." These American scholars, all of them wearing bow ties. You could see their faces, but the young staff around the walls are laughing. Well, you invited me, and I'm going to stick up for my side. So we did. We went through. I don't know. We first of all we had to come up with a rating system A, B, C, D. Sites that must absolutely be maintained, sites that should be maintained, sites that possibly should be maintained but might have to go. And the bottom was, we can't do anything about it. And I remember we got to New Orleans, and I said, "No, that doesn't even categorize. It was fought after the war had ended. There was a big argument there. I knew they were going to give it an A rating, but I was, you can't let the Yanks get away with stuff all the time. And finally, it got an A rating, as well it should. And Don Hickey and I don't know if you heard him. You heard the two of us arguing at a symposium in July. And I always say New Orleans was fought after the Treaty of Ghent, so it's not really a victory. Should be kind of he gets up on his high horse, being an American, and explains that the treaty wasn't valid until it was ratified by Congress, and it wasn't ratified till February. Uh, so New Orleans is a battle, but I digress. I do that quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah. It's as we got talking, about the unknown, unappreciated, a little one that never gets a mention is was it December of 1812 in Quebec or Lower Canada, Lacole Mill? Like, that was the third American offensive that never really got
Yep,
going, right?
yep.
So
It got old. They got really. I was just reading about that the other day. I think it was Lieutenant Colonel George McFeely's diary. He commanded a unit at that, and a U.S. unit, and they got confused. And I mean, in 1812, okay, look at it this way. In 1812, there were seven seven units in the regular American Army, seven infantry regiments. Now, the second, third, fifth, sixth, and seventh were in the Louisiana Territory. This is the bulk of your regular infantry, and you're going to mount an offensive against Canada. The first was in company-sized detachments on the Mississippi, and only the fourth was deployed and mobilized on the northern border, and it went into the bag at Detroit. The fifth and sixth were ordered to turn over their companies to the third and seventh, and they re-recruited. So the fifth and sixth were pre-war regulars by number and name, but they weren't. They were raw recruits. And then they raised 18 new regiments, and they're basically green. Yeah, and what was worse is the officers were green. So in 1812, the U.S. Army wasn't up to much, frankly. Um, got better in 1813, and it certainly by 1814 it was getting up there. We'll discuss that later, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
So,
You mentioned the fourth US, and it reminded me of I was traveling to Cardiff in Wales, and then it was the old Welsh Regiment Museum in Cardiff Castle. So they have the fourth US colors there. And so a friend that's on the US reenacting side asked me to get a picture of it, but because it's behind glass, it was really hard getting a good picture without, like, the reflections and everything. So unfortunately, the best picture that turned out was me standing in front of it with a thumbs up. So I said, I'm not
I'm
doing
I'm
this on purpose. This is
I'm
the
surprised that
best.
it's still was it what shape is it in?
It's not too bad. And a funny story was when they were moving stuff out because it became a new museum firing line. They found a second color that had fallen behind the cabinets. It's more like a streamer, but they said, "Oh, we didn't even know this has been here all these years. It was tucked away in behind." So,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Well, the thing is, in the Commonwealth tradition, colors are once they're um, taken out of service, the tradition is to lay them up in churches. And if you go to Britain, you go into some of these old churches. I mean, um, Canterbury Cathedral is the Buffs. That's the third, okay. And they have their colors going back to say 1700 in a chapel, but they're all surrounded by string bags because these things are gradually disintegrating. And it gets tired of sweeping the floor. So they just empty out these string bags. It's sad, but they weren't meant to last forever.
yeah,
Uh,
it's very strange. I'm similar in Cardiff. I've been to the Llandaff Cathedral where the Welsh Regiment Chapel is, and then you see the colors in the cathedral rafters hanging there. Uh, I'm digressing, but was really interesting. they have Invalids Regiment color in the museum. That's very little of it's left. Just more or less the netting or the the inner panel that the silk was sewn to. But that's it's really something to see something that old. All right, let's turn back to
Yeah.
you and stuff I want to ask you about. The different War of 1812 battlefields and historic sites. Do you have a favorite? And if so, why?
Well, I'd have to say Chippewa because I was instrumental in getting that made a historic site. There's a tale involved in that. I don't know if we have the time, but there is a story behind that.
I'll
If we
try.
got time,
Yeah.
sure. The prior to I think it was see Chippewa was never made a historic site. It was always private property, and right up to about 1991. And two men are responsible, really, for turning that into a historic site. The first one was a man named Arson Garaginian, an American who lived in Lewiston. And Arson used to take, he had a couple of boys. He was a U.S. Navy vet from the war, but he used to take his boys over the Canadian side of the river, and the full family would picnic. And a lot of people from Buffalo still do that. I'm not so, well, maybe with the recent unpleasantness, they don't cross. I don't know. But he went over one day and he saw a big sign said Executive Riverview Lots by River Realty, this whole area. And he knew this was the Battle of Chippewa because there was a Parks Canada plaque. And the plaque read, I may have some of the words wrong, but uh, on the 5th of July, 1814, a British Army under Major General Phineas Ryle engaged an American army under Brigadier General Field Scott. Early in November, the Americans withdrew across the Niagara to the United States. That's what it said. Okay, it got the name of the American general wrong. It doesn't mention that it was a British and Canadian defeat, and it just doesn't mention Lundy's Lane 40 or any of this. It just skips. Like, but at least it was and marked it. So to come back to Arson was very concerned because there were American war dead there, buried somewhere in that field, and he began to ask around. He's a very strong American Legion member, and the Canadian Legion post in Chippewa said no, the bodies from the battle had been removed to the local church, Anglican churchyard, and he couldn't get any interest at all. So he went to the top. He wrote a letter and addressed it to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Buckingham Palace, London, England. There was a letter saying that they were going to uh, develop a very historic piece of ground. Well, Buckingham Palace looks at it, Canada, right? High Commission, London, High Commission gets a hold of it, and the under assistant West Coast flunky says, American uh, 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 American military attaché in Washington. So it comes over to him. The military attaché, or maybe it was a third under assistant military attaché, looks at it. Well, what is this Chippewa? I never heard of this. But takes his D&D phone book and sees Directorate of History. They got to know something. So 5:30 at night, I was working late in the office. The inquiries officer came in and said, Don, you know about the War of 1812. Do you know anything about the Battle of Chippewa? And as it so happened, I was working on my Lundy's Lane book at the time. And I said, yeah, I do. We got a call from the military attaché in Washington, and he wants to know about it. So I said, well, sure, give me his number. So I phoned the fella, and he was very relieved to talk to someone who knew about it. And he said, Arson Garaginian in Lewiston is raising a fuss, and we don't know what to do and what to do. So I phoned Arson Garaginian and introduced myself as a Canadian historian, and he told me his story. Well, the fact I don't have the book handy, so I don't have the number of casualties. But the fact of the matter is, there's over 100 remains interred somewhere on that ground. And how to, yeah, um, a number of historical organizations told the city of Niagara Falls, because it had just expanded its boundary to include Chippawa, that this should be left alone. And there was a meeting of the town council, a special meeting on, folks from Fort Niagara came over. I had the U.S. military attaché and the one of the senior officers from the British Defense Liaison staff came down to attend this thing, and in uniform, which was great, because when you these city councils don't often get exposed to that. And a fella came up from Washington from the Veterans Administration, Bill Jane, hell of a nice fella, and I spoke up and said that there were human remains interred somewhere on that ground, and then everybody went, "What?" So I ended up saying, "Look, I was really going beyond my remit here, because I'm supposed to be doing Second World War naval history, but you wander aside sometimes." So I said, "Look, I'll prepare a report and on the size and location of the battlefield and whether there is or isn't human remains there." So I went back to Ottawa and got all the sources, all everything, and everybody. No source said that the bodies were disinterred and moved to the churchyard in Chippawa. The fact of the matter, the Anglican Church in Chippawa dates from the 1820s, not 10 years
Yeah.
later. I also check, because you always check when you're after something like this. You always go for the money, follow the money. So I went to the Upper Canada Sundries, RG5, the financial accounts, looking for payment for disinterring and transporting over 200 remains of skeletons. Couldn't find anything. So I figure, yeah, that's right. So I prepared my report. I won't get into details because it'll bore you. And then I gave it to, submitted it. And at this point, the second man involved steps in. And his name was Frank Branscombe. And he owned River Realty, which is going to develop this property. And he did not know, and often I think developers don't know, frankly, they just don't have the historical research, but he didn't know there were human remains in the ground. And now I never said what shape they would be in, because our ancestors, plowing, find a bone, find a skeleton, hey, neat. Uh, um, so I never specified the shape. But once he learned that there were possibility of human remains on his property, it turned out that his wife's father and uncle were killed on the Western Front in World War One, and he had been to Vimy Ridge, and they have those maple trees there, which supposedly um, every tree represents a fatal casualty. I'm not sure that's true, but he believes it, and he said right there, no shovel is going in that ground as long as I own it. So that brought the development to an end. And then it was a question of who would eventually take this over, because it has to be a historic site. The Parks Canada wouldn't have anything to do with it. Their official line was, "Well, we've discharged our responsibility with this plaque." The one I quoted, which is all.
Yeah.
So Parks Canada was out. Eventually, the organization that took it over was Niagara Parks Commission, as so they should. And then I was by that time working as a heritage consultant, so I did the research on the battle and did the interpretation. Those signs you see on the battle site are my writing, and there's a little memorial. It's not a big one, but there's a memorial there with the British and Canadian units on one side, the American on another side, the indigenous warrior groups on a third side, and a simple, I don't know what you call it, eulogy. And yeah, so those two men are responsible more than anybody. They're both gone now. Uh, but it just shows what you can do if you decide, to push.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
when the
it's
when
it's one of
sorry,
my favorite reenacting memories. I remember doing an event there, and you look at the pictures and you think this is probably the most realistic images you'll see because there's no hydro lines, no modern
yep,
buildings, no poles or anything. It was just like the troops moving through kind of mid-thigh height,
yep, it's probably one of the most pristine battlefields in eastern North America. There's less habitation there now than there was in 1814 because there was a farm there, and um, there was a road goes through, used to cut right through, called Edgeworth Road, and everybody interpreted the battle, thought this was the farm lane, but it wasn't. And when I was doing my research, I thought somebody must have done aerial photography of this site. And sure enough, I went to the Department of Mines, and they had the collection, and they started doing aerial photography in the 1920s. And one of the first areas they did was Niagara, and they did it in July. No, did it in the autumn after the crops had been taken off, and there you could see another lane, and you could see the foundations and a barn. And so that's where Samuel Street's farm was. So that when you come down the Niagara River Parkway and you enter that path that goes around, that is the location of the original farm lane. But
oh well.
I I think I answered that question and digressed a lot.
That's all
I
right.
do
That's
recall, and I shouldn't be mean, in the commemoration, we had a big commemoration, the opening of this official new historic site. Um, Pierre Burton was brought in as the speaker because, of course, he wrote books on the War of 1812. And I'm really glad he went before me. I forget what I said. I think I just talked about the men who'd fought there, the men on both sides of the border and from the indigenous nations. But he got up, and I sat there and mentally ticked the number of historical factual errors he made. But he's gone too, so I won't speak well of him. He was a very good journalist. I don't think he was that great a historian. Um,
no, some of his stuff I found not bad, and it was just my own thinking. He must have had some really good researchers working for him.
he had a lady working for
Yeah.
him. She was going around Ottawa buying dinner for historians. I was still in graduate school because I would have loved a free meal. But one thing that gets me about that book, those books are they're written in the present tense, and that drives me crazy. You know, it's you know General Drummond advances against the Americans. I don't like that. I guess I'm some ways a purist, but that's Chippewa.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you a closing question, and I'm glad we've allotted multiple sessions to explore the different topics we laid out. Uh, the titles of your books are very colorful. Where Right and Glory Lead, and All Their Glory Past. Merry Hearts Make Light Days are examples. What has inspired these?
Oh, well, the Lundy's Lane book, Where Right and Glory Leads, is the motto of the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery, which I was once a very modest member of. Quo fas et gloria ducant, where right and glory leads. So that was the title for the Lundy's Lane book. The first edition of that book, by the way, was done by an American publisher, and he didn't like that title, so he called it the Battle of Lundy's Lane on the Niagara in 1814, which is deadly. But once I had the glory thing, I actually wrote the Lundy's Lane book first. That's the second in the trilogy. But once I had the glory thing, I decided continue on with it. I have a theory about titles. There has to be a grabbing phrase, an explanatory phrase. So the next book was Field of Glory, the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, 1813. I got that phrase from a letter that Prevost wrote to the British commander at the battle, uh, saying, "Go ahead and achieve a field of glory." And my final book on the trilogy, and all their glory past, I was really looking around at that point for a glory, and it's not the best, but it's true to an extent because the war has ended. No, I've had a lot of fun with titles. Fixed Bayonets, uh, Dragon Rampant. Were Fixed Bayonets is the biography of Thomas Pearson, in my opinion, one of the finest officers, British officers of the War of 1812. He
We'll
fought at
talk more
Chrysler's.
on him in a future episode. So yeah.
Oh, yeah, I could talk. I wrote a book about it. Have you read the book?
Yeah, I have it in my stacks. So,
Well, it's a good book. I like that book.
yeah.
Anyway, the guy fought at Chrysler's Farm, Chippawa, Lundy's Lane, and both engagements at Fort Erie. He was wounded in two of them. Besides that, he'd fought in Holland, Egypt, Spain, Portugal, Martinique. You know, he was quite the fella. Um, so that was Fixed Bayonets. Um, Dragon Rampant, of course, was my history of the Welsh Fusiliers in the Napoleonic period, and their symbol is a dragon rampant. The one I had the most, the strangest one is, have you read Guns Across the River?
I think so. Which one was that?
Battle of the Windmill.
Yeah, yeah, I have a copy of that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that book is the funniest book I ever wrote, and it's just true. If people hadn't been getting killed, and some of them were civilians, it would make a beautiful comic opera. But
And so was that Upper Canada Rebellion or
yeah,
Finian?
1838, November
Okay,
of.
okay. That's
I had problems getting a title, and I was taken out to garbage one day, and of course, the windmill is a mile across from Ogdensburg, and the people in Ogdensburg used to come out in droves and watch the fighting going on. And I was taken out to garbage one day, and it sort of hit me. This phrase floated out of the air: "Guns across the river," and that worked both ways. So it became Guns Across the River, the Battle of the Windmill, 1838. Later on, maybe a couple of years later, I was thinking, Guns Across, where did that come from? And then I remember the song, the Dylan song. There's guns across the river aiming at you, lawman on your trail trying to catch you. That is stuck on my head. I hope Dylan forgives me.
there we go. So Bob Dylan inspires some of your book titles. So yeah.
Oh, music inspires me.
All right. Well, Don, thank you. It's always such a pleasure talking with you, especially on the War of 1812. That wraps up today's episode, and we'll have future episodes. So please subscribe to our channel, and then you'll get notifications of new uploads as Don and I complete these. So thank you, Don.
Well, thanks for having me.